Today, I'll tackle a fundamental question in scholarly writing. How do you write a literature review? Many of you are practitioner scholars venturing into formal empirical research writing, perhaps for the first time at this level. In this video, I'll explain and share effective practices for writing a literature review that is theory-informed, evidence-rich, and methodologically grounded. Before we begin, let me assure you, writing a strong literature review is difficult, even for seasoned researchers. Some scholars gauge the quality of your whole dissertation or research paper by the quality of its literature review. A poorly structured and written literature review signals a problem in the rest of the work. Why? Because a researcher cannot perform important research without first understanding the literature in the field. In other words, your literature review is the scholarly foundation of your research. First and foremost, a literature review situates your study in the continuum of existing knowledge. It demonstrates that you, as a scholar, understand the conversation and discourse that have been happening around your topic, and you can engage with it critically and constructively. One of the most common pieces of feedback I give to doctoral students is, your research question could be answered through a literature review alone. They do not require an additional empirical study. If existing research has already addressed your question with sufficient rigor and consistency, simply collecting more data to reach the same conclusions does not add any value to the existing knowledge base of the field. However, if the existing literature indicates conflicting findings, that signals an opening and opportunity for you to pose new, more refined research questions that clarify or extend what is already known. Reviewing literature helps to delimit your research problem, seek new lines of inquiry, avoid dead ends, and identify recommendations for future research. In essence, by reading prior studies, you learn what's being tried, what's worked or not, and where the gaps are. Moreover, a good literature review distinguishes what has been done from what needs to be done, uncovers important variables and constructs, synthesizes new perspectives, identifies relationships between constructs, and establishes the context and importance of your study. So your literature review is more than a summary. It should be a critical analysis that shows where your work fits in and why it matters. What does synthesize mean here? When I ask my student to synthesize empirical findings instead of cataloging who studies what and find what do I really mean? It means you combine and integrate findings from multiple studies to create new understanding or explanation of your interest, and that go beyond what a single study could provide. It means you identify patterns, relationships of the constructs, contradictions, mixed findings, and gaps across multiple studies to generate new knowledge. The missing synthesis part is the common mistake in many literature reviews I've read. I'll use some examples to further explain it. For example, you're interested in leadership effectiveness. Rather than simply cataloging that study A found transformational leadership increased the performance, study B found servant leadership improved employee satisfaction, and study C found authentic leadership reduced turnover, effective synthesize would examine those findings collectively to uncover common patterns. When you analyze multiple leadership effectiveness studies together, you often discover that seemingly different leadership styles, which is a pattern of leader behavior, actually share common underlying elements such as vision articulation, employee development focus, and ethical behavior. More importantly, through Synthesize, you uncover that leadership effectiveness depends heavily on contextual factors, including organizational culture, organizational structure, and employee needs. Through this integrative analysis, you may propose that follower needs serve as the underlying mechanisms explaining when different leadership styles prove most effective. This synthesis could generate a new theoretical framework demonstrating how leader behaviors, follower characteristics, and situational factors interact to produce optimal outcomes. This is how you move beyond leadership style outcome relationships to a much richer understanding of leadership. Here is another example. Let's say you are interested in organizational change management. Scattered findings from 50 change management studies may show that communication frequency correlated with change success, employee participation reduced resistance, leadership commitment predicted positive outcomes, and training programs yield results. Through synthesis, you identify that successful organizational changes consistently include multiple stakeholders in meaningful ways. The synthesis process also helps resolve apparent contradictions, such as why training programs sometimes succeed and sometimes fail. It shows that training effectiveness depends on integration with other change interventions rather than standalone implementation. More importantly, your synthesis uncovers trust in leadership as a key mediating variable that explains how different change tactics can actually work. With this understanding, you then develop a new change management model to show how communication, participation, and training all function by building stakeholder trust, which then drives acceptance and successful implementation. This synthesis provides both theoretical advancement and practical guidance that individual studies could not offer. Now, back to our topic on literature review. A strong literature review also provides a theoretical backdrop. It shows which theories have been used to explain your phenomenon and help scaffold your own theoretical framework. I'll talk more on that soon. A good theoretical framework can even be a source of inspiration, which leads you to refine your research questions and develop your theoretical framework. So the purpose of a literature review is not just to show you've read a lot, but to use that reading to sharpen your inquiry and build the foundation for new knowledge. Now let's get practical. How do you actually conduct a literature review step by step? This process is part detective work, part analytical work, and part writing marathon. I'll break it into manageable steps. As I go through this, I encourage you to think of how each of the steps applies to your own research project. Step 1. Identify and refine your research problem or question. Everything begins with a clear focus. Ask yourself, what problem am I investigating and what specific questions will my literature review help answer? The literature review is tailored to illuminate specific research questions. For example, if your research question is, how do leadership styles influence teacher retention in high schools? Your literature review's job is to explore what's already known or theorized about leadership styles and teacher retention, and perhaps related constructs like job satisfaction or school culture. In this step, define the scope of your literature review. Is it limited to certain types of organization, for example, K-12 schools or nonprofit organization? A time frame? Is it the literature about the last 10 years? Certain geographic context. Defining the scope of a literature review prevents you from either drowning in literature or unintentionally cherry picking. Very often, you'll start broad and then narrow down as you see what's out there. It's also important here that you consider what keywords or terms define your topic. This will drive your literature search. Also consider if you have a theoretical lens up front. For example, are you viewing the problem through a particular theoretical lens, like transformational versus transactional leadership? Identifying them now can help you organize your literature review later. Step 2, develop inclusion and exclusion criteria. This step is about setting clear boundaries of what literature you will include in your review. Although it may seem tedious at first, It is a very critical step of scholarly practice. Those criteria help you avoid bias, stay focused, and ensure that your literature review is grounded in the most credible and relevant scholarship available. Think of inclusion criteria as a set of guidelines that determine which study makes into your literature review. And exclusion criteria help you confidently set aside work that does not meet your standard or relevance thresholds. In some cases, you'll want to include only peer-reviewed journal articles and, more importantly, prioritize articles published in top-tier academic journals in your field. I have provided a list of those journals in the course. Not all peer-reviewed journals are created equal. Some have rigorous editorial standards and widespread influence, while others are less selective and even predatory. Intentionally focusing on publications from respected journals help you make a deliberate choice to build your argument on the foundation of high-quality evidence. You should also consider the hierarchy of evidence I discussed in my last video. At the top of this hierarchy of evidence are meta-analysis, systematic reviews, and large-scale studies with strong internal validity. Those types of studies provide more reliable evidence than isolated case studies and opinion pieces. Whenever possible, prioritize the strongest available evidence for your question, not just what is most convenient to find. In many disciplines in the social sciences, it is appropriate to exclude conference papers unless they have been peer-reviewed or are widely recognized as influential. This is because journal articles typically undergo more rigorous peer review. The exception is the field of computer science, where peer-review conference proceedings are the primary mode of disseminating cutting-edge research. Unlike in the social sciences, top-tier computer science conferences use rigorous peer review processes that are on par or even exceed those of many journals in terms of acceptance rates and review standards. Because of the fast pace of technological innovation in computer science researchers prioritize rapid dissemination, and conferences offer a faster turnaround than journals. But we're in social sciences, so prioritize peer-reviewed journal articles. Your inclusion-exclusion criteria may also need to include parameters for data range, language, research method, context, or population. You may limit your review to studies published in the last 10 years, include only studies published in English language, focus on comparative research rather than single-case research, or you limit your scope to U.S.-based studies if your inquiry is situated in the domestic policy context. Similarly, you may choose to include only studies of public institutions, excluding corporate sector work if it does not speak directly to your research questions. Establishing those inclusion and exclusion criteria at the outset makes your literature review more systematic and transparent. You may not need to list every criterion explicitly in your written review unless you are conducting a formal systematic review, but you should still apply them consistently. This disciplined scholarly practice will save you time when reviewing search results, and it will help protect against a common pitfall in graduate level research, relying on secondary sources or opinion pieces rather than engage with the original rigorous research. Your inclusion-exclusion criteria should guide you toward the highest quality, most relevant, and methodologically sound literature available for answering your research questions. And step 3, search systematically for literature. This is where the detective work begins. You hit the literature databases. Use your library's search tools, for example, Google Scholar, ProQuest, or discipline-specific databases. Cast a wide net, but strategically. Start with key terms identified in step 1. As you find sources, scan titles, and read abstracts, they may lead you to new keywords or synonyms you hadn't considered. For example, teacher retention may also appear as teacher turnover or teacher attrition in the literature. Adjust your search terms accordingly. This is a bit an iterative process. Search, scan results, tweak search I repeat again. You then use Boolean operators and or not for refinement. For example, leadership and teacher retention and school or education. And don't forget to search backward and forward in citations. When you find a great article, see who that article cites, that's the backward, and who has cited that article, that's the forward. Tools like Google Scholar cited by are great for this. This helps you capture seminal works and the latest studies build on them. A high-quality literature review aims to be comprehensive and balanced. A complete review is not confined to one research methodology, one set of journals, or one geographic region. If your topic spans multiple disciplines, such as psychology and management, or education and organizational behavior, it is essential to search across those bodies of literature. Too often, we see literature reviews that stays narrowly in one silo and miss critical perspectives from related fields. This is especially important in the field of educational leadership, which is fundamentally a subfield of management situated in the context of education. Many of our students enter doctoral study with strong backgrounds in education, but little exposure to the management literature. As a result, they often rely solely on education-specific journals and databases, and inadvertently overlook key theories and empirical findings from adjacent fields like organizational behavior, human resource management, and public administration. Bridging this gap not only strengthens the theoretical foundation of your study, but also signals to readers that you understand the interdisciplinary nature of leadership research. Equally important is the shift in mindset that comes with interdisciplinary approach. You're not simply thinking like a classroom teacher or instructional coach. Your task is not to figure out how to teach better. That's the domain of the teachers. Your role is to examine how to hire the right teachers, how to support and retain them, how to motivate them, and how to create organizational conditions in which they can thrive. And to do this well, you must understand how organizations function. That means asking questions such as, how do teams collaborate? Why do some teams sabotage each other's work? Why do turf wars emerge among different teams? How do organizational structure and hierarchies influence organizational behavior? How do culture and incentive systems shape individual decision-making and group decision-making? And how do leaders coordinate the actions of many individuals to achieve a shared goal? Educational leadership is not about pedagogy in classrooms. Instead, it's about the systems, the structures, and the processes that support or hinder collective performance in a specific context of education. Adopting this perspective allows you to engage more deeply with management theories and bring valuable organizational insight into organizational context. In addition to disciplinary breadth, you also need to strive for methodological diversity. If both the qualitative and quantitative studies exist on your topic, include both. Excluding one type can introduce bias and undercut the richness of your literature review and your later data analysis and interpretation. Finally, make sure to include seminal works, those highly influential studies or theoretical contributions that are widely cited and form the backbone of the field. Missing a seminal piece is a red flag. How do you know what counts as seminal? Start by looking at citation counts. Tools like Google Scholar, Web of Science, and Scopus allow you to sort results by how many times it has been cited, which can help surface foundational text. Seminal works often appear early in the citation chain of many other studies, and you'll notice them being referenced repeatedly across multiple articles. They tend to be published in top-tier journals and are frequently mentioned in literature reviews and peer-reviewed articles. You can also identify them by reviewing meta-analysis or systematic review on your topic, which typically summarize and synthesize the most influential existing research. Prioritize those works will not only strengthen your literature review, but also demonstrate your grasp of the intellectual lineage of your topic. Throughout the literature search process, keep your records. Keep a log of search strings used, databases, and dates, and the number of results. This may sound like overkill, but it helps later if someone asks, have you checked the databases X? You can confirm what you did. It also prevents the frustrating scenario where you think you searched something, but you just don't remember how. Even if you don't publish those details, having an audit trail is a good scholarly practice. Step 4, screening and select the most relevant source. Once you gather a large pool of potential literature, it's time to filter it down using the criteria from step 2. This often happens in stages. First, you read the titles and abstracts to eliminate obvious mismatches. For example, you may remove an article that looked relevant by keywords, but on closer inspection, it's about a completely different topic entirely. Next, you download the full text of the remaining articles and give them a deeper read. As you do this, you continually ask, does this article directly inform my research question? If yes, it stays. If not, set it aside. Be wary of common pitfalls, including too much, especially things often tangibly related. In the beginning, it's fine to be inclusive, better to have more and cut later. But as you refine, be ruthless in focusing on relevance. Remember, a literature review is not an annotated bibliography of everything you read. It's better to deeply engage with 30 highly relevant, high-quality articles than to superficially cite 100 sources that wander off-topic. Also evaluate the quality and credibility of each article. Is the study well-designed? Is it published in a reputable peer-reviewed journal? Is the author a known expert in this area? That doesn't mean you only include those studies, but you may give more weight to, say, a robust longitudinal studies published in a top-tier journal than to a small exploratory study in a lesser-known journal. If the exploratory study says something unique, of course you can include it, but just be clear about its limitation in your literature review. Another key point is that you must have a balanced mix of evidence. For example, both foundational works, if it is older, and recent studies, as well as diverse perspectives. Including only recent work may ignore why the field got where it is. Including only old seminal works may miss recent developments. Including only quantitative studies may bias your understanding if qualitative studies offer different insights and vice versa. So the diversity in sources strengthens your literature review's credibility. As you finalize your selection of sources, start taking notes. And this overlaps with the next step, but it's good to begin early. Many people use a matrix or spreadsheet for this, with studies in rows and the key themes or criteria in columns. I use Obsidian to take notes. For tutorials of using Obsidian to take notes on literature, see my video links in the description. Some of my past students liked it, others don't. That's okay. It's a tool. You choose whatever tool that works for you. In your notes, you should include APA citation of that article you read, the purpose of the study, the methods, the sample, the key findings, the theory used, how the theoretical constructs were defined, the limitation, and the quotes you can use in your own critique of that article. Those notes will offer great help when you synthesize the literature. They also ensure you connect each source to your own research focus, and you can add a section for relevance to my study. This addresses a major reason literature review falters. The researchers don't clearly relate the findings of the literature review to their own study. You should make that connection explicit in your own notes. Step 5, synthesize, analyze, and map the literature. Now we move from literature gathering mode to sense-making mode. Synthesis is the heart of a good literature review. But what does it mean to synthesize? It means you combine individual pieces into coherent narrative. Instead of writing Smith found this, Jones found that, and Lee found another thing in the list, that's summary of literature, not a synthesis. You compare and contrast those findings. What patterns emerge? What do studies agree or disagree? What factors may explain conflicting results? Are there themes or categories that you can cluster studies into? For example, you may notice that in educational leadership literature, studies cluster into themes like the impact of principal leadership on student achievement and the teacher job satisfaction, leadership training and development. Those could become subsections in your literature review. In each theme, you synthesize maybe studies with positive findings versus studies with mixed findings, or perhaps qualitative insights versus quantitative evidence. A helpful strategy here is to take a concept-centric approach, not an author-by-author recounting. So identify the key concepts, constructs, or variables in your collected literature and organize around them. For example, concepts in our teacher retention scenario could be leadership style, school climate, and teacher motivation. Group the literature by those concepts, constructs, or theme, not by individual author. So you are analyzing the body of knowledge, not just reporting it. It also helps you avoid the dreaded citation dump where you just string together a series of studies without any commentary. Instead, you may say, multiple studies indicate a relationship between principal support and teacher retention. Smith found that when principals adopt transformational leadership practices, teacher turnover dropped by 15%. Jones, however, observed that leadership had little effect unless accompanied by adequate resources, which suggests leadership works indirectly. Those findings imply that leadership influences retention through factors like resource allocation and teacher morale. See how we weave different sources together. You are telling the reader what the collective evidence says, where it diverges, and possibly why. Don't shy away from analysis and critique. A literature review is not just about what is known, it's more about how well it is known. You should evaluate the methods and arguments. For example, although several surveys reported a link between training and improved leadership effectiveness, they were correlational. The one experimental study found no significant effect. This discrepancy suggests caution in assuming causality. This critique demonstrates your critical thinking. In fact, a literature review should examine critically all aspects of the research design and analysis of studies, not uncritically accept their conclusions. So highlight the strengths of evidence and also gaps of weaknesses in your notes. Map the literature can be literal. Some researchers create visual maps or concept diagrams to see connections. You may sketch out a diagram linking constructs and studies. For example, a map where leadership style connects to teacher morale, connects to retention, with the studies annotating those links. And this can be your own understanding or even something to present in your own writing if it is helpful. Mapping is great for identifying theoretical lineage of ideas, which theories or findings led to what subsequent studies. If everyone is citing Bass' 1985 theory of transformational leadership, your map should reflect that lineage, and you'd better cite Bass' work. Failing to mention the seminal theories and classic studies can weaken your literature review, as some readers may think you don't even have a full understanding of this topic. So make sure to show and demonstrate you know the shoulders on which current research stands. Through synthesis, you'll start to formulate answers to big questions. What do we know overall? What are the contested issues? What are the gaps? Perhaps you find a gap. For example, a lot of studies on principal leadership in urban public schools, but hardly any in rural or private schools. Or perhaps a gap in how we understand the experience of new leaders versus seasoned leaders. Gaps are golden. They help justify your research. Also, identify contradictions. If studies disagree, that's something to explore, maybe due to context differences or methodological differences. This analytical work is what transforms your review from a summary of existing studies to a coherent argument that justifies why your study is important. By the end of this step, you should be able to articulate the state of the art on your topic. Having reviewed the literature, here is what we know, here is what we don't know, and here is how my study will contribute. And step 6, write the literature review and revise with your analysis in hand and perhaps an outline emerging from those themes and constructs you identified. It's important to actually write the literature review. Structure it in a logical way for your reader. Typically, you'll have an introduction to the chapter or your paper's literature review that restates the purpose of this literature review and how you organize it by themes, chronology, and methodological categories. Then, the body of your literature review, which follows the structure and synthesizes the literature theme by theme. And finally, a conclusion of the literature review. You summarize major insights and highlight gaps and the need for your research. In your case, since this is likely the part of your dissertation or research article, the conclusion of your literature review should explicitly lead to your research questions and theoretical framework. For example, you can say, in summary, prior research suggests a connection between leadership and retention, but it remains unclear which specific leadership behaviors matter most, especially in different contexts. No study to date have examined X. This gap will be addressed in my study, followed by your research questions. So this kind of narrative makes a clear bridge from the literature review to your methods section. How to connect your literature review to your theoretical framework? You can do it in 3 ways. First, use theory as a lens in your literature review. If your study is grounded in a certain theory or theoretical framework, let that guide your literature review. For example, you are using transformational leadership as your theoretical lens. In your literature review, you should discuss studies that have examined transformational leadership in relevant contexts. You'd note how that theory has been supported or challenged, and you may use the theory's constructs, for example, idealized influence and individualized consideration, as an organizing theme for discussing leadership behaviors in prior research. You make it clear that the theory of transformational leadership is not an afterthought after you have the research findings. Instead, the theory is the anchor of the study from the very start of your research. Your literature review scaffolds your theoretical framework by providing evidence and examples of how the theory plays out. Second, identify theoretical perspectives in the literature review. In many literature reviews, you'll find that different authors explain the same phenomena in different ways. One may use social identity theory, another uses distributed leadership theory, another uses psychological burnout model. Part of your job is to identify those theoretical camps or perspectives. You may even organize a part of your literature review around them. For example, approaches to teacher retention falls into 3 theoretical categories: economic theories of labor markets, organizational theories of school leadership, and the psychological theories of teacher motivation. Then you discuss and synthesize literature in each of those categories. This not only shows you understand the theories, but also it can illuminate why studies sometimes have different findings because they're looking through theoretical lenses. So comparing how multiple theories address your topics helps you discover that one has more explanatory power or multiple elements need to be integrated. Reviewing literature helps in relating ideas and theories to applications. In other words, you see how abstract ideas have been applied in empirical studies, and you can critique and build on that. Third, don't just describe, analyze, and theorize. We touched on the difference between description and analysis of the literature earlier. Here it becomes essential. Descriptive writing in a literature review may say, theory X was proposed by so-and-so and has been used in studies ABC. That's a fine background. But analytical theoretical writing would go further. Theory has been useful in explaining short-term organizational change, but it struggles to account for long-term cultural shifts, as noted by author C. This suggests a theoretical limitation. X may need to incorporate factors in institutional memory or culture to fully explain relationships, which is a gap theory Y attempts to fill. You see the difference here? You're not just telling us which theories exist. You are examining their adequacy and relationships. This is often done in a critical review or theoretical review. It's higher order thinking. Rather than what do we know, it's how do we explain what we know. Describing versus analyzing versus theorizing elevates your literature review. Describing is listing what happened, analyzing, examining why and how, and often comparing studies. And theorizing is abstracting patterns to a conceptual level, possibly by proposing how things may fit together. One final point, revise, revise, and revise. A literature review benefits enormously from revision. Once you have a draft, step back and ask, is the logical thread clear? Did I sufficiently synthesize rather than summarize? One technique is to read only the first sentence of each paragraph, which is a topic sentence. Does that alone tell a coherent story? If not, consider reorganizing and strengthening those topic sentences. Ensure that you've been critical where needed, not just praising studies, but also noting limitations. Check that you have not overstated results or made unwarranted generalizations, and stick to what the evidence supports. It can also help to get feedback. Revising also means checking the balance. Do you spend too long on less important literature and gloss over key works? Are all major points supported by multiple sources for triangulation where possible, rather than a single source? That relates to something like avoiding isolated statistical results rather than synthesizing them. Essentially, make sure you integrate findings across studies, and importantly, make sure your literature review flows into your next section. It could be methods or theoretical framework. The end of the literature review should set up the need for your study. So when you start talking about your methods, it feels like a natural next step.